Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 2. Now let's start the fanfic. Naruto was tired. Not so much tired in body, but just tired of dealing with all the thoughts going through his head. The only stroke of luck was that their debriefing was postponed to tomorrow due to a council meeting. After the long trip back, he came straight home, intending to go to sleep even though it wasn't anywhere close to being his usual bedtime. Usually he would have paid a visit to Ayame, but he was just too tired of everything to do it now. He'd go visit her tomorrow. Welcome home, Naruto. He had certainly not expected to see Xana when he arrived. Don't get him wrong, he was always happy to see her, especially as it had been a while since she had come around, but he didn't feel like he was in any shape to be having a decent conversation with her. The demoness was sometimes refreshingly blunt and straightforward, but she could also be maddeningly inscrutable and difficult to figure out. He was really not in the mood to play mind games with her. He was still not really over the whole incident with Tsunami and had been hoping that he would have some time for it all to settle before Xana came around. She was dressed in her usual red silk yukata that exposed her dusky legs and cleavage, giving tempting glimpses of what was hidden beneath. The whole thing was even more tempting because he knew that she never wore any underwear beneath it. "Hi Xana, have you been waiting for me?" Naruto asked curiously, as this was the first time that she had greeted him after a mission. "You could say that. Come with me." The demoness beckoned him, which made him curious. She was acting rather oddly. She led him towards the table in the living room where he usually ate whenever he bothered to cook something for himself. On that table sat a large bowl of ramen, very good ramen if the smell wafting from it was any indication. He didn't eat the stuff often, as it was quite unhealthy, but it was his favorite food, stemming from the fact that the dish was connected to the first act of human kindness he could remember in his life. He looked at the red-haired demoness in shock. "Did you make me ramen?" There was a vast amount of incredulity in his tone. She had never done anything of the sort before. Aside from the kindness she had shown him during his childhood, she had at most given him only some advice or hints as to how he could do something himself. "Yes, it was the least I could do, considering the fact that I led you into a situation that had you falling in love and then being forced to make a choice. But I didn't." "How did?" Naruto was unable to even finish a sentence in his shock, not knowing whether he should deny falling in love or ask how she knew about it. "There is no point in trying to deny it, especially to yourself. You did fall in love with that Tsunami woman in the short time that you knew her." Xana cut him off. "As for how I knew, well, just because I am out of that seal, doesn't mean that we are not still connected by it. The will of the death god is not going to be undone by the decision of a mortal." She said this while tapping his stomach, causing the seal to appear again after years of being invisible. "How are we still connected by the seal?" Naruto asked curiously, setting aside the more discomforting issues for now. "While I was still your prisoner, you had many privileges over me. One of these being the ability to read my thoughts, had you known how to do it. Now that the seal is open, that link goes both ways, though of the two of us, I am the only one who knows how to use it." She explained to him, with just a faint hint of smug pride in her voice, while Naruto just looked at her in shock, having never imagined that she could just read his mind at will. "You needn't look so shocked, I don't often make use of it." Naruto was somewhat reassured by this, though still severely off-kilter at learning that the woman he wanted to marry could read his mind. Most people would call him completely insane for that alone. "So you know everything that went on in Wave. I could sense that you were in some distress, so I checked and found out that you had developed feelings for another woman while on that mission. I did not care to look at anything else." She did not seem angry, but Naruto knew better than to take that at face value. Human women were unpredictable enough about these things, the demoness before him was another matter entirely. So, are you angry at me for letting that happen? Naruto asked with only a small amount of hesitation. As far as he was concerned, it was better to just get it out in the open and deal with the consequences. Don't be an idiot. I was the one who arranged for it to happen after all. Now sit down and eat your ramen. She said with only mild irritation in her voice. She could see that he was obviously not operating at full capacity, or else he never would have forgotten the fact that she had already told him that. The blonde sat at the table in a daze. All the revelations that he had just heard on top of his already tired mind was not leaving him particularly clear-headed. So he just did as he was told and went to eat his ramen. It was really good ramen, the best he'd ever had actually. This is amazing, I didn't know you could cook. Naruto complimented and fished for information simultaneously. You'd be surprised at all the things you learn to do just for the sake of doing something when you're immortal. There was a dry amusement in her voice, implied that cooking was hardly the only thing which she had taken up out of boredom. He finished the ramen and was about to ask another question about arranging the incident with Tsunami. He had figured as much himself that night after verbally ripping Inari anew, but it was always good to get some details. His question, however, never left his mouth as she grabbed his hand and led him into the bathroom. The bathtub was full of water and obviously prepared for him. In short order, they were both lounging in the hot water, with Naruto unable to hold back a happy groan as he felt the relaxing embrace of the water. Xana settled onto him, using him as a backrest, and he eagerly wrapped his arms around her. Moments like these were precious, and the combination of hot water and having her so close was leaving him extraordinarily mellow. So you knew what was going to happen in Wave? Naruto asked finally. No, but I knew something like that was bound to happen eventually. You may not have noticed it, but in your pursuit of me you have developed a strength of both body and character that many women will find attractive. It was inevitable that eventually you would come across a woman that you could spend the rest of your mortal life with, if you allowed yourself to. Xana explained. So you told me to continue sleeping with other women to make sure it happened as soon as possible. Naruto concluded. Exactly. I must say I am rather impressed that you figured that out. The demoness complimented. She very much wanted him to stay hers, but it was best to get this kind of thing out of the way as soon as possible. She would have been quite upset with him if he decided that she wasn't worth the effort, but not surprised. But what was the purpose of it all? Why even engineer that situation when I would never have abandoned you for another woman? Naruto couldn't prevent himself from being at least somewhat upset by her actions. His heart protested the decision to leave Tsunami despite it being the only thing he could have done. It would have protested abandoning Xana even more. Emotions were such messy things. If possible, his feelings would have urged him to keep them both, no matter how impossible that was. Xana just gave a sigh at having to explain this. It's not that she didn't understand his confusion really, she was just not fond of being questioned and explaining herself. You saw how easily you developed feelings for that woman and felt the temptation to stay with her. You have no idea what an oddity you are. You were presented with two roads in life at that point and you chose the harder one knowingly, perhaps an impossible one. That is simply not normal for humans, or anyone for that matter. Just about everyone will always choose the path of least resistance, and yet you chose the harshest of roads for a tiny chance at achieving something that you promised as a 10-year-old instead of the easy path that would have made you happy right away. Naruto was quiet for several moments as he digested that. If he understood correctly, then Xana had more or less expected him to give up on his desire to marry her once he realized how hard it would be. When that hadn't happened, she had engineered a situation where he would be presented with an alternative choice, an easier choice. When he had turned away from that as well, she had apparently been quite surprised despite showing only minimal signs of it. What she had done today, making him ramen and this extraordinarily relaxing bath, was her way of apologizing for causing him heartache. She wasn't sorry for doing it, but she did apparently feel at least a bit bad about hurting him with it. There are rocks on every road, it's all just a matter of kicking them aside. He answered her softly, but firmly. The road you've chosen has mountains on it, Naruto, was her dry response to his moment of philosophy. A mountain is just a big rock anyway. If I can't kick it aside, I'll climb over it, Naruto retorted, now smiling. What a monstrous will you have. If you're not careful, you may end up becoming Hokage by accident. Xana teased, but was genuinely impressed by his determination. It wasn't every day that you encountered someone so incredibly stubborn. And end up like that old buzzard doing paperwork behind his desk all day. No thanks, though I wonder why he doesn't just use shadow clones to do his paperwork. Naruto retorted. Not to mention I would probably murder the council in a fit of rage when they eventually annoyed me enough. So you've never considered becoming Hokage? The demoness asked in genuine curiosity. They had never spoken of it, but she thought that he would have at least considered it. I've considered it once or twice, but I've set my sights much higher than that, and even if I hadn't, I'm more of a fighter than a leader. Naruto answered. Besides, I'm not really loyal to the village, the only loyalty I have is for you and Ayame. The village is just a convenient place to grow stronger until I find a way to reach your level. My, how very devious of you. She purred. It's pretty hard to be loyal to a village that did its best to me when I was a child. You were the only reason I survived. He responded warmly, his heart rate jumping at the purr in her voice. As soon as he was done speaking, he leaned close to her and gave her earlobe a lick, which made her turn around and kiss him, which swiftly turned into a battle of tongues. Xana decided to cheat and poked him in the side, making him twitch as he was somewhat ticklish there. Once Naruto was distracted by the poke, he swiftly lost, and the demoness wasted no time in pushing her tongue into his mouth, running it over the sharp teeth that she had given him without fear of injury. Naruto once more lamented that Xana had created a human body for herself that wasn't ticklish. Their kiss ended soon after and they got out of the cooling water. After they dried up, Xana led Naruto to his bed, knowing that he was still tired and that some sleep would leave him feeling much better. As Naruto settled into bed with Xana laying her head on his chest, he thought about everything that had happened recently. The whole thing with Tsunami had left his heart somewhat mauled, but if given the choice he would go through it again. He felt that Xana was now more certain of his conviction, and that was something that he needed if he wanted to win her over. Power alone wouldn't be enough, at least not as far as he was concerned. He also needed to impress her as a person if she was ever going to love him the way that he loved her. XX. Xana was awoken by the feel of lips kissing her neck and smiled slightly, but pretended that she was still sleeping. They were currently both lying on their side, with Naruto spooning her. It was still very early in the morning, before dawn even, and she had no intention of getting up yet. A large hand gently grasped her and began to knead it, making her give an appreciative hum at the attention. Her nether lips moistened as she felt his already hard member press against her posterior. A choked-off scream escaped her throat when he suddenly pushed her onto her stomach and thrust inside of her. She grinned to herself. That had been unexpected. He had never been so forceful with her before, and she liked it. He lifted her up onto her knees and continued pushing himself inside her from behind with slow, deep thrusts. Her enjoyment of the steady pace was interrupted when he lifted her backwards so that she was sitting in his lap with her legs spread widely, still impaled on his member. She would have protested the new position as it didn't allow him to penetrate as deeply as before, but his voice in her ear interrupted her. This is a new idea I've wanted to try for a while now, let's see how you like it. His voice was a deep, lusty growl that left her eager to see what he had come up with. His unpredictable nature all but assured her that it was going to be interesting. His left had moved to her and his right went between her legs. At first nothing special appeared to be happening, before the demoness suddenly felt a constant and powerful stimulation being focused on the cluster of sensitive nerves just above her opening, with the same thing happening to her left soon after. She was quickly left panting as he began to thrust inside of her again, all the while keeping up whatever he was doing with his chakra to create this kind of stimulation. Her legs began to draw together automatically in response to the pleasure, but he surprised her again when he created chains to hold her legs open. In normal circumstances she could have broken the chains, but he had strengthened them considerably since he first managed to create the chains and she was in no position to bring her full strength to bear on them. Her hands went to her S and helped stimulate them. She was panting rapidly and her skin gleamed with sweat as she shuddered with anticipation of her coming orgasm. Just as she was achingly close, however, he suddenly stopped and left her trying to catch her breath at the very edge of an orgasm. "Don't you dare stop!" She managed to pant out in a growl, angry that she had been denied her climax at the very end. His left hand moved over to her right in response and resumed stimulating it, his right hand doing the same to her. Before long she was back to panting, but this time the buildup of pressure was slower, as Naruto apparently figured out how to regulate his chakra just right to draw things out. When she finally reached her orgasm, the sound that escaped her throat was something between a scream and an inhuman roar. Nothing else existed except for the pleasure surging through her body, especially as he hadn't stopped manipulating her most sensitive pleasure zone with his chakra, prolonging her orgasm. Her legs would have clamped together instinctively, but the chains kept them spread wide. When she came back to her senses, she realized several things. She was on her knees again, unchained, with Naruto still very hard inside of her, and her release had been explosive enough that both she and Naruto were soaked in the juices she had released, not to mention the bed. She also became aware of the fact that she didn't feel the liquid warmth inside of her that would indicate that he had climaxed with her. The few men and women that she had deigned to sleep with before had been nothing but playthings used to scratch an itch, and doing a poor job of it too. Naruto, however, had somehow learned to play her body like an instrument, had made her scream out her pleasure and surrender control to him completely, which had never happened before in her life. When she had told him to learn about and practice, she'd never imagined that he would be capable of something like this. She was still panting when he started thrusting inside of her again, making her give out low moans as her hypersensitive entrance was penetrated again. Then he did something that made her eyes fly wide open in shock. Naruto had seen that they were both covered in her glistening release, which included the small ring of her anal entrance. He didn't have much experience with anal, his size usually preventing such a thing, due to the pain it would cause. The only one who had wanted to try anal with him had been the S&M-oriented Keiko, but according to what he had been told, there were strong erogenous zones inside the anus. Seeing as it was already lubricated, Naruto pushed his middle finger inside, knowing that trying to penetrate her back door with his would be a bad idea. What the hell are you doing?" Xana demanded, still panting heavily. She'd never done something like that before and she hadn't expected Naruto to do it either. Instead of answering, the blonde began thrust harder and move his finger inside of her anus, looking for any sensitive nerve bundles. When he found something that he thought might be his target, he began pressing his finger against it, swirling his chakra around it chockily. A feeling of immense pleasure slammed into her and she wasn't even aware that her screams were slightly demonic and were scaring the early risers outside of Naruto's apartment. Her second orgasm hit her with the force of a sledgehammer, and this time she clearly felt Naruto shooting thick ropes of his seed inside of her barren womb, making her climax all the more intense. She felt his finger being withdrawn and he collapsed on top of her, his teeth sinking lightly into the flesh between her neck and shoulder, making her shiver at the sensation. Both were panting heavily and ready to take a short nap as their bodies relaxed. They were slick with sweat, dripping from her explosive first orgasm and absolutely reeking of, but the only thing they could be bothered to do was move to the other side of the bed, which was at least somewhat cleaner. Naruto made sure not to pull out of her, as they both liked to stay that way after they had. He couldn't help but let a proud and self-satisfied grin split his face as he spooned up to her, gently nibbling at her skin with his teeth. Xana simply lay there, legs still giving the occasional shudder, and enjoyed the aftermath as her body cooled down and her lover teased her skin with soft bites. So explain to me again why you'd want me to do this with other women? Naruto asked lazily. He had been trying to find a way to ask this question for a while now, and right now she seemed as mellow as she would ever be. To be blunt, because I consider the rest of you humans as barely above something to play with, and it makes a good learning experience for you. She retorted, completely lacking any empathy for any human aside from him. That's really harsh, Naruto answered with a sweat drop. I will be very upset with you, however, if you decide that you would prefer a mortal woman after the decision you made to leave the one in wave. As far as I am concerned, you burned all your bridges with that decision. The demoness said pleasantly, but the menace was clear in her voice. Naruto was not overly bothered by her tone. It was hardly the first time she'd used it on him after all. You say that, but you still want me to sleep with other women. You never know when I might get bored and decide to add someone new to play with. Naruto needed a few moments to process that sentence before he could respond. Looks to me like I was perfectly capable of satisfying you just now. He retorted with some smug pride coloring his voice, punctuating his statement by thrusting inside of her with his once again hard member. He had just pushed fully inside of her when her inner walls unexpectedly clamped down on him so tightly that he honestly didn't think he could pull out if he wanted to. A blazing heat suddenly enveloped him and she began moving her pelvis just slightly, but it seemed as if her insides were squeezing and stroking him all by themselves. It was the most maddeningly wonderful sensation that he had ever felt, and it left him groaning in pleasure, unable to even think about how in the hell she was doing this. Just when he thought that it couldn't possibly get any better, or perhaps worse, her hand went down to his testicle sac and started to gently fondle it. Immediately he felt the same burning sensation there that he was feeling on his rod and felt the pressure of a coming orgasm, but unlike before, it was so intense that it actually hurt. In no time at all he was releasing inside of her again, but in volumes that he'd never imagined were even possible. She was still clenched around him just as tightly as before and forcefully draining every last drop out of him. When it was over, Naruto was left a gasping mess, struggling to even stay conscious. You aren't the only one who knows a few tricks. The red-haired demoness purred. What was that? Naruto managed to gasp out. Just a little something I learned to do. Xana answered haughtily. You should be proud of yourself. The last man I used that on died. What a way to go. The blonde murmured sleepily and quickly lost his battle against unconsciousness, making the demoness grin. It had been a very long time since she had been able to enjoy her life like this. Despite knowing Naruto for all of his life, he had still surprised her a lot when he had decided to walk away from a woman that he could have been happy with, a woman that would have asked nothing of him. In all of her centuries-long existence she had never encountered a man that was so single-mindedly focused on something quite like this. Oh, there had certainly been people with an obsessive fixation on something, but these were usually madmen with a lust for power. Naruto cared for power only as a means to an end. It was rather odd to see actually. Someone so determined to become the most powerful man to have ever lived, and yet there was not a hint of the corruption that such power usually brings, because he was doing it to win her over. If she had told him that she would only marry him if he turned a mountain to rubble with a toothpick, then she knew that he'd go do that with the same intensity as he trained. It was quite flattering to have such devotion focused on her, and she couldn't deny that she found his intensity and force of will attractive. Despite her initial reluctance to get attached to a mortal, he was wearing down her resistance with the same bull-headed determination that had driven him for many years now. She didn't expect him to ever live up to his promise though. Humans simply weren't capable of reaching her level of power, not in any way that she could think of, and thought of it she had. But that was all right. She wasn't going to marry him, as her pride would not allow her to marry someone who was not her equal, but she would enjoy the fire that burned in his soul just for her. She had been furious beyond all reason when the Yondaime had first sealed her, and would have taken out her anger on Naruto had they met when she was in such a state. Fortunately, the years between her sealing and meeting Naruto for the first time had dulled that anger considerably. He had been such a cute little thing when he had first blundered into the seal, blue eyes wide and curious. With her anger cooled, she had been unable to muster any hostility towards the tiny golden-haired child that was staring at her with completely innocent blue eyes. When she had first started to comfort him when his sleep was plagued by nightmares, she hadn't expected that he would latch onto her quite so tightly, but in hindsight, it should have been obvious. She had been the only good thing in his life and therefore immediately became the most important thing in his life. Naruto had turned out to be a bright spark in an existence that had become gray and dreary long ago. If she was capable of such a thing, then she would have been sorely tempted to make him immortal just so that she could keep him around longer, though the more she thought of it the more distasteful the idea was. She knew that an eternal life would change him, there was no way that it wouldn't. It would be worse to see him lose that energy that he now had than to see him die with it still burning in him. Death she could accept eventually, she had no choice in the matter, but to see him become jaded and listless would darken his memory, and the memory of him was all that she would have once he died. Xana pushed the thoughts out of her mind and just focused on enjoying the moment. That was the key to making immortality bearable after all, to shut out thoughts of both the past and the future and simply live in the present as much as possible. There was no point in thinking about it in any case, since there was no way to make a human immortal that she knew of anyway. Well, it appears that Team 7 has had a most interesting first C-rank mission. Sarutobi commented mildly after hearing the full mission report. Considering everything you've told me, I have no choice but to classify this as an A- ranked mission. Sasuke and Sakura looked smug and excited respectively, while Naruto and Kakashi looked as if they didn't care, which was fitting as they really didn't. I am giving Team 7 a week away from duty, but before you go, I need Naruto to explain one other thing to me. Everyone looked at the aged leader curiously, wondering just what exactly he could want explained, considering the fact that they had already told him everything and wondering why Naruto in particular. Earlier this morning several civilians reported that they heard what sounded like the tortured screams of a woman coming from your apartment, Naruto. Sarutobi said, with a clear demand for an explanation. Kakashi automatically smiled at hearing this, while his younger two students looked both resigned and annoyed. Well, you see, Hokage-sama, I had a new technique that I needed to test out, so I chained the woman in question to my bed and began to apply it. She seems to have found the technique to be quite powerful and began screaming like a demon almost as soon as I started using it on her. Naruto explained with a completely straight face, struggling mightily to suppress his laughter. Kakashi began snickering at the explanation, and at the Sandame's horrified look. He knew that Naruto would never touch an unwilling woman and was being deliberately misleading with the way he'd explained. "ID idiot, don't say it like that. It's bad enough that you've slept with the client on nearly every mission we've ever had. I don't want people thinking that my teammate is a rapist too." Sakura shrieked hysterically. "Stop screwing around and just tell the truth, Naruto." Sasuke ground out through clenched teeth, an eyebrow twitching madly. "Everything I've said is true." Naruto insisted. "Naruto, are you telling me that you've raped a woman just this morning and then used her as a target to test a new ninjutsu?" The Sandame's horrified whisper floated through the air. Sarutobi felt like he was having a heart attack and felt his world crumble. He had tried for years to befriend Naruto and failed. If the boy had turned out to be a monster that would abuse women like that, he would never forgive himself. Minato had been one of the kindest and most gentle men he had ever known, at least outside of a mission, and to have the man's son become an abomination like Orochimaru would be too much to bear. "I don't recall mentioning anything about rape or ninjutsu." Naruto deadpanned. Sarutobi sighed as he realized what exactly had just happened. Someone had obviously heard Naruto engaging in some very loud and reported it, and now the blonde had used the situation to screw with him. He hadn't even been aware that Naruto was usually active. As he calmed down a bit, Sarutobi cottoned on to something that Sakura said, which he had overlooked before. "What do you mean Naruto has slept with nearly every client?" Kakashi couldn't help but give a perverted giggle at the memory of his student's experience with D ranks. The Junin had no doubt that Naruto was the only genin who had ever enjoyed his D ranks. "Well, Hokage-sama, apparently Naruto is rather popular among the ladies," Kakashi explained with much amusement in his voice. "But they're not supposed to do that. The ninja corps is not an escort service." Sarutobi protested weakly, suddenly realizing why Naruto had been the only one to receive such praise on his missions, not to mention the sometimes strange wording of it. "I assure you, Hokage-sama, they had other duties for my cute students," Kakashi assured his leader. "That's not really the point," Sarutobi replied with a sweat drop beading on his forehead. "Don't worry about it, Hokage-sama. It was all for the best. After all, if not for that, I may have lost control of my beastly urges and kidnapped a woman off the street," Naruto said blandly. Sarutobi winced at the words, knowing that they were a rebuke for jumping to conclusions about Naruto being a rapist earlier. He sighed heavily and dismissed the team. Not long after, Sasuke and Sakura had gone their separate ways after Sasuke had once again refused her invitation for a date. Kakashi was also just about to head home when Naruto spoke to him. "I need your help on a few things, Kakashi-sensei." "What kind of things?" "Well, I need you to point me at someone that I could spar with on a regular basis, and I also need to talk to a genjutsu specialist," Naruto explained. "The sparring partner I understand, and I even have someone in mind, but why the genjutsu specialist? I thought you couldn't use genjutsu," Kakashi asked curiously. "Well, aside from learning how to get out of genjutsu, it's also because of something to do with my fuinjutsu research." Kakashi raised an eyebrow in interest at hearing that, but decided not to pry. His own knowledge of fuinjutsu was rather haphazard, but he knew that the art required the user to know all sorts of things about chakra. "Well, if you want a sparring partner, then you'll want to find Team Guy. Their Junin-sensei, Maeda Guy, is a taijutsu specialist and so is one of his students. He actually has the opposite problem of you, as he doesn't produce enough chakra to use ninjutsu or genjutsu. As for a genjutsu specialist, you'll want to talk to the Junin-sensei of Team 8, Yuhi Kurenai," Kakashi advised. "That's perfect. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei. I wonder if he'll end up sleeping with Kurenai too," Kakashi wondered with a perverted giggle once Naruto left. Asuma would probably be pissed about that. Several days later, Naruto was approaching the training ground of Team 8, who had just arrived home from a mission the 2 days ago. Since Team 7 had come back to the village, Naruto had been working on several projects, such as his wind and water training. He had discovered that training his water affinity was going better than wind, which was fine with him as he was more interested in water anyway. Wind was fairly one-dimensional, as it was heavy on offense and had very little other uses. Water, however, was far more versatile and had all sorts of esoteric uses, not to mention that he found it easier to control water-natured chakra for some reason. His greatest interest, however, was in fuinjutsu. It was a complex and demanding art, requiring knowledge of all sorts of oddball things that most shinobi never even thought of, but in exchange for its difficulty of learning, it was also without a doubt the most powerful of the shinobi arts. A skilled fuinjutsu user could do practically anything if he knew how. He had hit a roadblock when he hadn't been able to find enough information on yin and yang natured chakra. He knew that chakra was a mixture of physical and spiritual energy, but yin and yang release were highly specialized and refined versions of this concept. He was actually gambling on the idea that a genjutsu specialist would have some information on yin release at least. He had already met with the eccentric Junin sensei Maeda Guy and arranged for frequent sparring matches with the equally eccentric Rock Lee. It had been surprisingly easy to get them to agree to it. The two of them were always glad to help a fellow Leaf shinobi, and once they heard of his troubles with ninjutsu, they had started shouting about how youthful he was for working hard to overcome his weakness and enthusiastically invited him to join them in their daily exercises. They were weird and creepy as hell with their eyebrows, spandex, bowl cuts and sunset genjutsu, but he could definitely respect their determination. They had been confused when he told them that he had an alternative to training weights, but hadn't made a fuss over it. The only real downside to them was their teammate Hyuga Neji. The guy was of the highest order, always making remarks about losers sticking together and claiming that fate would not let them excel as shinobi. Naruto made a note to beat the crap out of that guy one day. He had vaguely known Lee, Tenten and Neji from the previous year of the academy, but he didn't recall Neji being that irritating. Kurenai was definitely a beautiful and exotic woman, with her red eyes and untamed black hair. Her strange bandage dress was also quite an interesting outfit. The Junin in question noticed his approach and was puzzled. She knew that he was Kakashi's student, making her wonder why he was approaching their team. Her genin had also noticed him and had various reactions to the tall blonde's presence. Hinata was blushing madly because he was effectively topless, covered only by the long black coat which he kept open at all times. She wished that she could be as bold as him, but she was too embarrassed to even take off her oversized coat because of her developing S. Shino had no obvious reaction, but his insects were reacting excitedly at the approach of Naruto's powerful chakra. Shino had never been quite sure what to make of his former classmate. The chakra that his Kikaichu could sense was absolutely gigantic, and yet he was supposed to be the dead last. Kiba didn't really know what to think of Naruto. On the one hand he was the dead last, but on the other Akamaru was telling him that the blonde was dangerous. He didn't really think that Naruto was all that dangerous, but he did remember that the blonde never lost a spar in the academy. Yuhi-san, you have been pointed out to me as a genjutsu specialist. There is something I need to discuss with you. Naruto stated once he was close enough. He could be polite and use honorifics when he needed to, though it irritated him. Forgive me if I'm wrong, Uzumaki-san, but you don't seem like a genjutsu user. Kurenai returned. She knew perfectly well that he had far too much chakra and too little control for genjutsu. I'm not, but I still need the help of someone with a strong grasp of the art. How about we discuss this over lunch? Naruto offered. Kurenai raised an eyebrow at the lunch invitation, ignoring the surprise on the faces of her genin. She'd heard some rumors about this student of Kakashi. She found it hard to believe the rumors that said he'd slept with half the women in the village, but she still found that lunch invitation suspicious. There was no denying that he was attractive, but she had no intention of being any Mon's latest conquest. I'm afraid I can't accept your invitation, Uzumaki-san. My team and I already have plans to go for lunch. They are welcome to join us if they wish. What I wish to discuss with you is nothing secret. I will pay for all of them. Kurenai let a small confused frown surface on her face. If he was freely inviting her genin to join them for lunch, then he was almost certainly not attempting to get into her panties. Could he actually want to discuss genjutsu? She looked towards her students, clearly questioning whether they wanted to accept the invitation or not. Free lunch is always good, Kiba said with a grin. I have no objection, Shino said stoically. Hinata just nodded, still embarrassed. Naruto led them towards Ichiraku's, which had over the years expanded to serve more than just ramen. Tsuki had taken all of their orders already and they were now waiting for their food to arrive. So, Uzumaki-san, you said you wanted to discuss something about genjutsu. Kurenai began. Just Naruto please, and yes, I had several things I wanted to discuss with you. Naruto answered. Alright then Naruto, what was it that you couldn't ask Kakashi, since I know that he is proficient with genjutsu? Kakashi knows how to use genjutsu, yes, but I needed someone with a much better grasp of it. I'm studying fuinjutsu, you see, and I'm making an educated guess that a genjutsu specialist could help me with a problem I'm having. Aside from that, I would also like to learn how to get out of genjutsu from you. Naruto explained. Kurenai was very surprised to hear this. Fuinjutsu users were extremely rare. She only knew a few fuinjutsu techniques and had struggled hard to learn them. What are you working on that you would need a genjutsu specialist to help you? Kurenai asked, intrigued. I've recently been researching the specifics of yin and yang chakra, but I've hit a bit of a roadblock in regards to that. I'm working under the assumption that genjutsu uses mostly the spiritual aspect of chakra, am I right about that? Naruto explained. Yes, genjutsu uses very little of the physical component of chakra. Kurenai answered. I must say that I am very surprised you even know about yin and yang chakra. Very few Junin even know about that. Fuinjutsu makes you learn all sorts of strange things. Naruto said as an explanation. Well, anyway, I've been attempting to create a seal that would allow me to store some yin chakra. Since the yin aspect is form without substance, I am assuming that genjutsu powered by yin chakra alone would be at their most powerful. Eventually, I hope to create a method to harness the refined yin and yang chakras instead of the watered-down versions that most shinobi use today. Kurenai was now seriously impressed. That was the kind of thing that made shinobi legendary, though it sounded like a difficult undertaking. You intend to attempt using purified yin chakra to power genjutsu, like the Nadaime Mizukage was rumored to be able to? She asked. I didn't know that bit about the Nadaime Mizukage, but no, I'm afraid that I'm not much of a genjutsu user, though I am interested in seeing the effect of yin chakra genjutsu. I'm theorizing that the physical component present in the genjutsu that shinobi use is making it easier to dispel the genjutsu. You've definitely caught my interest, but if you're not attempting to use yin release genjutsu, then what are you doing this for? Kurenai said curiously. I'm interested in seeing what I can do with the refined yin and yang chakra. I'm fairly sure that the yang chakra won't allow anything more than body enhancement since it is substance without form, but I may be able to craft a seal to use them in some unorthodox ways, perhaps even a combination of the two. Kurenai just stared at him for a long moment, deep in contemplation before answering. That sounds incredibly interesting, but I'm afraid I don't know how to use pure yin chakra. I've been trying to figure it out for a long while now, but I've had no success so far, so I'm not sure how much help I'd be. I didn't expect you to know how to use it, but I'm hoping that with your genjutsu expertise, I could make a breakthrough in my fuinjutsu research, and who knows, we might figure out a way to harness yin chakra while we're at it. Aside from that, I'd still need you to teach me how to break out of genjutsu. So what do you say, Kurenai-sensei? Naruto asked, referring to her as sensei with a smirk. He knew that she was very interested in this and would probably be unable to resist. Kurenai thought it over for another long moment, but she knew that she was going to accept. She had been trying to figure out how to use yin release for a few years now, and then a fresh genin comes along with a proposal to use his skill with fuinjutsu to try and figure out the problem. Even if he was a fresh genin, he spoke about the subject with enough familiarity that she had to take him seriously, and even neophyte fuinjutsu users weren't to be underestimated. Alright Naruto, I accept. Hinata, Kiba and Shino had been silently observing this entire conversation with a great deal of surprise. Their supposedly dead last former classmate had just now been engaged in a debate about some very high-level chakra theory that they had never even heard of. It was at this point that Ayame came out of the back with the food they ordered. Kiba immediately forgot about the discussion he had just overheard and stared at the beautiful waitress. "Hey baby, where've you been all my life?" he said to her while checking her over. Ayame only raised an eyebrow at the much younger boy trying to be smooth. He was hardly the only one to try a lame pick-up line, and definitely not the best. Kurenai meanwhile was severely irritated with her student. He'd been showing all the signs of a budding lecher, and all of her attempts to prevent him from becoming the next Jiraiya had failed so far. "Stop sniffing around my sister Kiba," Naruto demanded. "Your sister?" came a chorus of confused and questioning voices. "Not by blood, but he's thought of me as a big sister for many years now," Ayame explained with a smile. Aside from Zana, Ayame was the only who knew pretty much everything about him. She even knew about Zana and what he was trying to achieve. That she hadn't tried to convince him out of it or judged him for it, had made her all the more precious to him, and he definitely wasn't going to tolerate some mutt trying get into her pants. Well, even if she is your sister, it's up to her to decide if she wants to have an animalistic experience, Kiba retorted with a smirk once the surprise died down. "I'll be sure to tell you that when I go after your sister and maybe your mother too," Naruto retorted, making Kurenai choke on her food, and Hinata began to give off red light. Even Shino was blushing, though it was almost unnoticeably, maybe even both at the same time. This last bit made Hinata go nuclear, and even Kurenai was blushing. While Kiba was spluttering in shock, Naruto looked at Hinata and just couldn't restrain himself from commenting. "If you blush any harder, Hinata, people are going to mistake you for a lantern from the red lights district." This was too much for the girl, and she passed out, forcing Shino to catch her. By this time Kiba had managed to regain his ability to talk and burst out. "You stay away from my mother and sister, bastard. And what do you mean when you go after them? Well, since you're such a supporter of allowing women to choose who they want to sleep with, I figured that I should let them know that I'm available," Naruto said magnanimously. Kiba gaped at him for several long seconds before responding. "Alright, I get the point. I'll stay away from yours if you stay away from mine," he grumbled. "Agreed," Naruto said pleasantly. "But if they come after me, then all bets are off." "That'll never happen," Kiba shouted. "Keep telling yourself that, Kiba. It might actually be true." Naruto paused. "Then again, it might not be." 2 months later. The 2 months since Naruto and Kurenai had agreed to work together had been very productive in several ways, though Naruto had gotten the most out of it by far. Kurenai had decided to teach him how to dispel genjutsu first, and as was typical for Naruto, he did nothing normally. He wasn't able to manipulate his chakra flow enough to halt it and break the genjutsu that way, and he didn't like the idea of sending out chakra pulses or stabbing himself, so he came up with his own unique way of breaking genjutsu. He had discovered the method accidentally when he had been trying to stop his chakra flow, but had condensed it instead. Turns out that if someone's chakra is dense enough, then the foreign chakra of a genjutsu wasn't able to pass through his coils and do its job. Kurenai had been both shocked and irritated when they discovered that this made him effectively immune to regular genjutsu, at least as long as he kept his chakra condensed. They hadn't managed to figure out the yin release, and Naruto had theorized that his fuinjutsu knowledge wasn't good enough. He had managed to convince Kurenai to bring him all the fuinjutsu books and scrolls from the Chunin and Junin sections of the library, despite the fact that she shouldn't have done that. The red-eyed Junin had loaned him the books under the condition that he was to only look them over and see if anything in there could help them in their research. Naruto had agreed, but as soon as he got home, he had created a small army of clones to copy everything that she had brought him as soon as possible. He now had a small army of clones constantly working on assimilating all the knowledge that had suddenly become available to him. The things that he had seen in those books were simply far too interesting to let go. What had him the most fascinated by far was instructions for how to inscribe small fuinjutsu formulas with just his chakra and sometimes a small amount of blood. For larger seal arrays, he needed to prepare them in advance, and then he could slap them onto the ground where they would expand, and then they could be controlled by use of a master seal that he inscribed on his body. It irritated him immensely to go on missions now, as it was taking time away from his training and fuinjutsu study. Merely days ago, he had finally cracked the secret of how to manipulate gravity with fuinjutsu. He needed to inscribe an area with a sealing array, after which he would capable of adjusting the gravity within that area. The potential for training in a higher gravity environment had left him salivating, but he had no chance to make use of it yet. He had even found a way around his problem with ninjutsu. Naruto was now capable of inscribing a sealing array that would mold the chakra for whichever ninjutsu he wished, as if he were making hand seals, as long as he knew it well enough. Unlike hand seals though, he didn't need to worry about control, as the sealing array did it for him. All he needed to do was channel chakra into it and the technique would form. This was certainly interesting, but he had long since lost interest in regular ninjutsu. He hadn't stopped working on elemental manipulation either, and he was now greatly intrigued by the possible applications of water-natured chakra. He'd determined that the flowing nature of water, combined with his highly dense chakra, allowed him a degree of control over water that mere hand seals didn't allow. He still didn't have any techniques, but he was working on a few things that held a lot of promise if he could get them to work. All of this work and the near-constant stream of memories from his shadow clones had unfortunately left him operating under a constant mid-level headache. Naruto was sure that if it wasn't for his healing factor, his brain would start leaking out of his ears. This had been confirmed when he had knocked himself out once during a D-rank mission and his team had been forced to carry him to the hospital. When he'd woken up, he heard terms such as neural bruising and brain damage being tossed around, which had convinced him to tone it down just a little. Another thing that had changed were their D ranks. The Sandaime had apparently had a stern talk with potential clients about using his shinobi as an escort service, which meant that Naruto was no longer able to screw with the minds of his teammates in that way. The damage had been done, however, and Team 7 now had a rather questionable reputation. Naruto and Kakashi were perfectly fine with it. Sakura and Sasuke, however, were not. The Pinkett couldn't even walk down the street without wanting to sink into the ground when the villagers leveled disapproving looks her way. On the other end of the spectrum, Sasuke was getting lots of approval from his fangirls, who had gotten 10 times more rabid, leaving the Uchiha survivor at his wit's end at the creepy stalker tendencies they were now exhibiting. Currently, however, Naruto was not suffering any headaches or driving his teammates insane. At this moment he was engaged in a spar against Kurenai. The two of them had been working on their project for some time and Naruto felt that some progress at least had been made, but they were both tired of breaking their brains over it and wanted to relax a bit. Naruto had suggested a spar and Kurenai had been curious as to how good Naruto really was. Her curiosity also stemmed from the fact that both of their teams had been nominated for the upcoming Chunin exams and she wanted to see how he measured up compared to her own genin. She had come to regret agreeing to this spar, as she had discovered several truths that were making things very difficult for her. She wasn't able to use genjutsu against the blonde due to the fact that he was condensing his chakra, which meant that she had to rely on taijutsu and ninjutsu, both of which were most definitely not her strong points. Naruto was stronger than her, faster than her, and his body was so densely muscled that even her chakra-enhanced blows were not having any great effect. She on the other hand had to be extremely careful to never even directly block one of his hits, as the shattered log that she had used for a substitution testified. The only thing even keeping her in the fight was her greater experience, flexibility and the few Kaden ninjutsu that she knew, while Naruto was limited to taijutsu and shadow clones. She knew however that if the blonde managed to get her into a grapple that it was going to be all over for her. Kurenai was already panting and feeling the drain from using her much neglected ninjutsu, while Naruto had a wide and excited fanged grin on his face, not tired in the slightest. He looked a bit singed from a close call with a fireball not long back, but she could see the burn healing even now, leaving him in perfect health. He had discarded his coat and was facing her barricaded, which was somewhat distracting. Naruto could have ended the fight long ago if he had used his chains, but he was still trying to keep that secret, even though he figured it was only a matter of time before Sakura blabbed about it. Deciding to finish it, he made several clones and then rushed at the red-eyed woman, making her wary of what he might be planning. The clones were only moderately difficult to dispatch because of their one-hit limit and soon she was left facing only one Naruto. He rushed at her and she prepared herself for another difficult taijutsu engagement, but was left shocked as he dispersed after a single hit, leaving her wide open for the original to grab from behind and wrestle her to the ground in the same hold that he had pinned Haku during the wave mission. As Kurenai had her hands pinned and the blonde firmly planted between her legs, she was left helpless. The only techniques that she could perform without hand seals were genjutsu and the 3 academy techniques, which were useless right now. The Junin was quite angry at herself for falling for that trick. Naruto had been coming at her with straightforward attacks like a juggernaut the entire time and then blindsided her with this tricky finishing move. Currently he was grinning at her widely, pleased with the fact that he had won against a Junin, even if she had been severely handicapped. "I win, Kurenai-sensei." "So you do." She grumbled slightly, her pride mauled at the fact that she had lost to a genin. Even if she had lost however, she couldn't deny that their current position was rather enjoyable. She had developed an undeniable attraction towards the blonde. She had gotten to know him over the 2 months that they had worked together and she was very impressed with the kind of man that he had turned out to be, despite the rumors about him. She had even made her romantic interest in him clear, but he had told her that he wasn't interested in starting a serious relationship, which was what she wanted. They'd talked it over and Kurenai had been mildly surprised to hear that there was some truth to the rumors about him sleeping with numerous women, if not exactly half the village. The surprise had been because he hadn't acted in a perverted manner with her in the slightest, aside from a few offhand compliments about her beauty, which was what made her think that the rumors were entirely made up due to him being the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Kurenai hadn't wanted it to be just, so she had backed off, but her attraction hadn't diminished in the slightest. The red-eyed Junin couldn't blame him for not wanting to get into a serious relationship at his age, but it was still frustrating her to no end. He was the most interesting and impressive man out of a rather limited selection of them, even if he was 10 years younger than her and he wasn't willing to engage in anything more than casual. She couldn't even get angry at him since he had openly stated everything instead of perving on her. Maybe we'd better get up. I think we're giving your Genin a show. Naruto told her with a smirk. What? Kurenai yelped and turned her head to see that her 3 students were indeed looking at their compromising position with incredulous blushes. The 3 of them had just arrived for their scheduled training session to find the 2 of them sparring and had been shocked to see Naruto winning. They didn't understand why their sensei wasn't using any genjutsu, but it was still shocking to see a genin winning against a junin. Even more shocking had been to see the blonde tackle their sensei into a rather intimate position and then have a short conversation with her like that as if it was no big deal. They quickly got on their feet, Kurenai blushing heavily at being seen like that and Naruto just smirking, not embarrassed in the slightest. Well, Kurenai-sensei, we'll continue our research after the Chunin exams. I hope to see your team participating. After saying that, Naruto left, leaving Kurenai alone to explain her embarrassing position to her students. Omake. The reason that Kakashi nominated his students for the Chunin exam. Team 7 was waiting for their perpetually tardy sensei to arrive on their training ground. Naruto was nursing a splitting headache caused by too many close dispersals, which had flooded his poor abused brain with complex fuinjutsu arrays and formulas. The fact that he hadn't even gone to sleep last night was not helping his headache. In spite of this, however, he was excitedly scrawling seals on a large scroll. The reason he hadn't gone to sleep was because of the seal he was currently inscribing. If his research was correct, then this seal would allow him to view an alternate dimension by increasing the gravity in a small area to truly ludicrous levels and pouring a large chunk of his chakra into the seal to power it. The destabilizing effect of such a powerful gravitational force should allow him to open a rip in space-time for a few seconds before the chakra powering the seal ran out. There were several other minor arrays included that would cause further destabilization and guarantee some kind of effect. Sasuke and Sakura were deeply freaked out by the crazed expression on the face of their teammate as he scribbled on his scroll and therefore unwilling to ask what the hell was wrong with him. Yo! Kakashi greeted as he suddenly appeared. You're late. Sakura gave her customary shriek. Sorry. I couldn't find any clean socks to wear. Kakashi told her with an eye smile. You're not wearing any socks. You never wear socks. Exactly. Ignoring his sputtering pink-haired genin in favor of looking at the somewhat unstable-looking blonde. Naruto, put that scroll away, we've got some training to do. I'm almost done, sensei, I've got to finish this. Kakashi looked at his student with a resigned sigh. He knew that look. It was the same look that Kushina and sometimes even Minato-sensei wore. That look meant that Naruto wasn't going to be able to think of anything except that seal until he finished it, and he was going to ignore everything until he was done with it. Make no mistake, Kakashi was proud of his student for many reasons, but he was just as brilliant as his parents and 3 times as crazy. Alright, Naruto, I guess we can wait for a little while for you to finish. Naruto rapidly finished inscribing the seal, before making a clone that held well over half of his chakra and having it take the scroll a safe distance away for, just in case, purposes. The clone was looking rightfully nervous, as many clones had met their doom because of experimental seals. Everyone was tense as they observed the clone pouring its chakra into the seal. They began to see the space around the scroll warping chockily. Before anyone could comment or attempt to approach, the warping suddenly exploded into a twisting nether of color, some of which existed and many of which didn't. The clone was seized by tentacles that writhed in ways that hurt their eyes to look at. A gaping maw opened with countless rows of teeth and multiple tongues that sprouted yet more mouths and drew the utterly terrified-looking clone inside. Bruschlifanglarukakor Wulgrothnath G. Zintuchar. The voice crawled through the empty training field like maggots through a corpse, and it felt as if the very air was howling in pain from hearing the words which required a trans-dimensional tongue and multiple separate voice boxes to pronounce. The clone popped when it heard the voice, and the rip in space-time slammed shut, cutting off a tentacle, which rapidly dissolved into nothing. Kakashi looked at his three students, sporting the same empty and horrified look in his eye as they were. All of them had blood steadily dripping from their ears, eyes and nose, and their minds were already hard at work repressing all memory of the event. I shouldn't do that again. Naruto spoke, already rationalizing that it had all been a product of his overworked and sleep-deprived brain. I was hoping that I wouldn't need to tell you not to try any reality-breaking fuinjutsu as long as you're still my genin Naruto, but I guess I really should have. Kakashi spoke with a hollow voice to his similarly traumatized students. I'm nominating you for the Chunin exams and you had better get promoted. I'm not going to take responsibility if you sink the world into some extra-dimensional abyss. Sensei, what are we going to tell the Hokage about this? Sakura asked, her voice shaking and her eyes moving from side to side in wide-eyed horror. Nothing of any interest happened here, Sakura. We were all feeling a bit under the weather and decided to cancel training for today. Kakashi spoke, still with the same absolutely hollow tone. But sensei. The Pinkett tried to protest. Nothing happened, Sakura. Kakashi insisted, voice still hollow. Why yes sensei, you're right, of course, nothing happened. Sakura agreed with a hesitant smile. Of course their sensei was right, silly her, being worried over nothing. It was just a normal day after all. It was too bad about the cancelled training, but other than that it was a perfectly normal, sunny day. Maybe we could all go get something to eat together, you know, as a team. Sasuke suggested, looking as if his eyes were about to roll up into his head. He suddenly didn't want to be alone. It's a perfectly ordinary day, with absolutely nothing special about it. It's too bad that Sasuke-kun doesn't want to get anything to eat, but that's alright, because it's perfectly ordinary. Sakura insisted to herself and walked off. The others left soon after, the memories buried under a mountain of instinctive mental blocks that the entire Yamanaka clan wouldn't be able to break through. All that remained was Naruto's intense reluctance to experiment with dimension-destabilizing fuinjutsu, Sasuke and Sakura's sudden terror of anything with tentacles, and Kakashi's intense desire to nominate his team for the Chunin exams. Naruto was sitting on his father's stone head, just taking in the view and thinking. The past 2 months had been good to him, he had learned a lot and felt that he had made good progress. He felt a bit bad about lying to Kurenai about those fuinjutsu books, but it's not like he was intending to use that knowledge for anything particularly bad. The red-eyed Junin had surprised him when she had told him of her romantic interest. He had honestly not been expecting the somewhat aloof woman to develop that kind of interest in him. Beautiful though she was, he had no intention of getting involved in any serious relationships, at least not with anyone aside from Xana. He wasn't quite sure how to classify his relationship with the demoness, but she had been around more often than usual these past 2 months, which made him happy. She was difficult to read, but Naruto hoped he wasn't wrong in thinking that he was getting through to her. An ancient demoness she might be, but there was only so long that she could keep her distance, and despite what she might say, he was certain that power wasn't the only thing that she cared about. His thoughts were interrupted when he sensed the arrival of the very demoness that had been on his mind. Have you come to enjoy the view with me? Actually, I came to warn you, but watching the sunset with you does sound pleasant. she said, and settled herself between his legs and leaned back on his chest. Warn me. This must be quite important if you felt I needed warning. Naruto answered in surprise. It is. I have sensed the arrival of my weakest brother, Shukaku. Zana stated directly. The Ikibi, is he sealed? Naruto asked thoughtfully. Shukaku has been sealed inside something or other for centuries. The bloodthirsty lunatic doesn't have the wits to regain his freedom. The demoness spoke scornfully. You mean he's not like you at all? The blonde asked in surprise, having expected all of the Biju to be more or less similar to Zana, if less powerful. There is no one like me, she said evenly, but Naruto thought that he could detect a hint of an old bitterness in her tone. Naruto carefully considered how to approach this subject. He really wanted to know what this was about, but he didn't want her to clam up. You know, I've been told that I give a good massage, but I'd like your opinion on my technique. We can talk some more about this while I'm working you over. He offered. Zana sent him an amused look before agreeing. The two of them were now in Naruto's apartment, with Zana lying face down on the bed, completely. Naruto, also, was preparing to begin the massage as he straddled her hips. He kneaded her shoulders and began to swirl his chakra chakadali, so that it would push into the muscles and loosen them. Zana purred her enjoyment of his efforts and began to speak. For you to truly understand the difference between me and the other 8 Biju, I need to start at the very beginning. She began. Several thousand years ago, there were no Biju, no shinobi, not even chakra. Naruto was quite shocked by this, as he had thought that chakra had always existed, but didn't interrupt. The only thing of notable mystical power was the Shinju, the god tree. What was the Shinju? And what about the people of that time? Naruto asked, intensely curious. The Shinju was the last remnant of divine power in this world. From what I understand, the gods have long since left this world, leaving behind only the Shinju. The only one who remains is the death god, and he is but a faded specter of what he once was. Though even diminished as he is, he remains the most powerful entity known to this world. She explained. Naruto was so caught up in the story that he forgot to keep massaging for a moment, but a shake of her shoulders reminded him. As for the people, well, they were much the same as they are now, except for the fact that they lacked chakra. This was a good thing in my opinion, as they were capable of doing less damage that way. I guess that means that they were constantly warring with each other. Naruto guessed. Exactly so. This went on for a long time, with the Shinju being revered but mostly ignored, until a princess by the name of Kagaya saw that the god tree had borne fruit. She had good intentions, thinking that if she ate a fruit from the Shinju, that she would be granted powers that she could use to stop the constant war. So what went wrong? While eating the fruit did indeed grant her great power, she was naive in her thinking that humanity was going to stop warring with itself just because she was more powerful than them. She may have eventually brought them all down, but her peace would have been forced and only lasted for a few decades at the most. I'm getting the feeling that something else went wrong, Naruto said, moving his hands further down her back. Zana hummed in agreement and continued with her tale. She was pregnant when she ate the fruit, and the power that was granted to her was only further concentrated inside of her unborn son. The child was different from the very beginning. He possessed eyes which frightened all who looked into them, glowing purple orbs with no pupil or sclera and a ripple pattern. It came to be known as the Rinnegan. It was a manifestation of divine power, and it granted abilities that mortals were never meant to have. Naruto moved his hands to her lower back as he spoke. What happened after that? Kagaya named her son Hagoromo and attempted to live out a normal life, but it was not to be. Hagoromo grew far faster than he should have and rapidly began to display powers that dwarfed even those of his mother. Kagaya got her wish about ending the war between the separate factions of humanity when the Shinju began to move. Move. Wasn't it just a tree? A divine tree, yeah, but still a tree. Naruto asked in surprise. Everyone was as shocked as you, as the Shinju had not moved for as long as anyone had known of it. But apparently it had sensed the theft of its fruit or the fact that Hagoromo had gained access to divine power and began to reshape itself. What was once a tree, became an immense 10-tailed demon god. 10-tailed? The blonde burst out in shock. Yes, it was the very first tailed beast, a divine entity that had turned demonic in its rage. It rampaged across the land, destroying everything in its path until Hagoromo went to challenge it. Naruto moved his hands to her butt cheeks and began to rub them vigorously, which made her purr again before continuing. You must understand that the power of the Shinju had no limit, and yet Hagoromo, who had taken to calling himself the Sage of Six Paths by then, was able to challenge it. The man was an aberration that should never have existed, a human with divine power, a mortal god. Their battle raged for days, both had access to limitless power, both were able to draw power from their surroundings to replenish themselves. The only true difference between them was that the Shinju was a rampaging beast and the sage was a man capable of making complex plans, which is why he won. How did he manage to do that if they were both unable to ever truly run out of juice? Naruto asked curiously. He saw that every time he blasted away a piece of the demon's flesh, it would spawn lesser demons, which fled from the battle and went to seek human victims. In a desperate gamble, he used Fuinjutsu to seal the beast inside of himself. Naruto had moved down to her legs by this point. Shouldn't that have him? From what I know, I would have died if I had been any older when Dad tried to seal you into me. He commented. Anyone else would indeed have died, but due to the vastness of his own power and the Rinnegan, he had no trouble sealing it at all. Anyway, now that the 10 tails was taken care of, Hagoromo was left with the problem of the many lesser demons that had scattered to the winds. He went to hunt them immediately, but for all of his power he could only be in one place at a time. The demons preyed on the weak humans of the time, many of them developing a taste for the women. Naruto's face twisted in disgust hearing that, and it was hard to keep from clenching his hands painfully around Xana's legs. While the sage hunted the demons, many of the assaulted women became pregnant from this and bore offspring. Contrary to what the sage had feared, the children were perfectly human, though they were surprisingly capable of using chakra just like him, though on a much smaller scale. Some of them even displayed distinctive abilities that would later become known as bloodlines. So you're telling me that chakra and bloodlines are the result of women getting raped by demons? Naruto asked with a scowl. Even if it was long since over, he didn't like hearing about something like that. Not entirely. The sage sired children of his own and was able to awaken the ability to use chakra in humans with some effort. He traveled the world, preaching about peace and spreading the teachings of chakra throughout the elemental nations. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that it didn't work out the way he wanted to. Naruto said dryly. Everything seemed to be going well. The land had settled into peace and Hagoromo was able to spend more time with his sons, but he eventually grew old and began dying. He knew that once he died that the creature he kept imprisoned within himself would be free again, and this time there would be no one to stop it. Which is why he used his powers to split it into 9 pieces. You and the other Biju. Naruto realized. Yes. He had little time left in the world by then, and he told us of our origins and asked that we provide guidance and counsel to the humans, so that the peace could last. Of me he asked that I look after his descendants and make sure that they do not abuse the powers that were granted to them. Who were his descendants? Naruto asked curiously. The Senju and the Uchiha, though they were not known as such at the time. The Uzumaki splintered away from the Senju a long time ago and the Hyuga splintered from the Uchiha even longer ago. She explained, leaving the blonde badly shocked. It was less than 2 generations after the old sage died that things started going wrong. Humans began using chakra as a weapon of war. The Uchiha heiress at the time, who was Hagoromo's granddaughter, was assaulted by one of the few remaining demons, and the powerful spiritual chakra she had inherited became corrupted, leading to the creation of the Sharingan. So the Sharingan is a demonic bloodline? Naruto asked once he'd gotten over his shock. Yes. Its wielders are naturally predisposed towards the darker emotions due to this, as the Dujutsu feeds off them. When I told you so many years ago that I had sensed great amounts of human malice in Konoha, it was mostly from the Uchiha. It feels odd to know that the descendants that I was asked to watch after have all but wiped themselves out or been wiped out. Zana mused idly. Naruto was by now struggling to keep all of this in mind, so he asked another question that had caught his interest. So, what did you mean when you said that there is no one like you? Zana sighed and answered. Because the sage screwed up. The way that he made us ensured that I was the strongest by far, possessing more than half of the strength that the 10 tails had, because he placed the most faith in me. Hagoromo, despite all of his power, was still a human, and he didn't truly understand what it meant that the Shinju had become demonic. The other 8 Biju were unstable because they lacked the power to sustain their minds, and all of them eventually went feral, only regaining some of their sense when they are sealed inside of humans and borrowing their sense of identity. This was only worsened as humans began attempting to use them as weapons, which incited their rage. The world once again descended into war, and I abandoned the elemental nations altogether for many centuries. I even left behind the name that the sage had given me, as it was connected to the task he wished for me to do. Is that why your name sounds so foreign? Naruto wondered, moving his hands up to her upper back again. Good guess. Yes, I chose this name from another land, and before you ask, yes, there are several other continents on this world. I was not known there, and I bided my time instead of watching my siblings go mad and watching you humans using a spark of divine power to each other. Spark of divine power. Chakra. Of course. You know of the Nadaime Hokage and his resurrection technique. Did you think that it is normal to rip a soul out of the pure world and force it into an undead body? I'm sure there are several other examples of humans using chakra to violate the natural order. Does that mean that you could do something like that as well? Naruto asked curiously. No, while I am capable of many things, reaching into the afterlife is barred to me. I was created from a corrupt and demonic power. This makes my own chakra naturally destructive, but it also prevents me from using many of the abilities that humans are able to. With age I have managed to subdue the worst of the rage I inherited from the 10 tails, but it is always there. Had we met when I was younger, I would have you for the slightest irritation. Well, I'm glad I met you in your old age then. Naruto joked. A dusky-skinned foot lashed upwards to smack him in the back, knocking him off balance and making him fall on top of her. Enough stories, you have one other place to massage. Zana whispered suggestively. It will be my pleasure. Naruto whispered back into her ear as he slipped inside her. Hours later, when they were both spent and just laying together in bed, Zana spoke again. As I have said, be wary of whoever contains Shukaku. He is the most unstable among us and is likely to have driven his host insane with his bloodthirsty raving. Is there any way for me to identify him? Naruto asked. He has powers over sand, so his container is likely to have similar powers. Last that I saw of him, he was rampaging in the deserts to the west, so he has no doubt been sealed by the hidden sand. Naruto's smile was hidden by the darkness. Now he knew for certain that he was making progress in carving out a place for himself in her heart. She wouldn't have warned him if she was still just testing him to see if he was worth her attention. Naruto was looking at Lee getting his kicked with some confusion. They had just entered the academy building where the first phase of the Chunin exam was supposed to take place and were immediately forced to plow through a crowd. Fortunately, Naruto's size had allowed him to more or less bulldoze through the crowd. Seeing Lee get pushed around by a couple of Chunin as if he was a wimp was an odd sight, especially since they were doing it in front of room 201. For the life of him, Naruto couldn't figure out why everyone was trying to get into that room since the exam was supposed to be in room 301. If you can't even get past us, then you might as well go home. One of the Chunin said disdainfully. Real nice speech, now reverse the genjutsu and let us through. I'm sure Sakura noticed it a mile away. Sasuke said, walking towards the Chunin with his hands shoved into his pockets. Genjutsu. Naruto could have smacked himself when he realized that he was doing his genjutsu immunity thing and hadn't even noticed. He had taken to keeping up the chakra condensing as much as possible for as long as possible in an effort to see if he could make it second nature and had gotten blindsided by his own ability. I got confused by reality instead of a genjutsu, oh the irony. So you noticed the illusion, did you? Let's see you deal with this. The Chunin with the bandage across his nose said and flew into a kick. Sasuke reacted with a kick of his own, but before anything could connect, Lee caught both of their feet in one hand each. Finally done pretending to be a wimp, Lee, Naruto asked his sparring partner. Naruto, I am glad to see that you are participating in this most youthful exam. Lee responded enthusiastically. You know this guy? Sasuke asked, wanting to know more about the weird guy that was strong enough to block his kicks so easily. We spar together when both of us have time. Naruto answered. While this short conversation had been going on, Lee had stepped in front of Sakura and began talking with a small blush on his face. You are Sakura, yes. My name is Rock Lee, please be my girlfriend, I vow to protect you with my life. Lee said with a thumbs up, his teeth pinging. Sakura was looking a bit ill at the thought of it. Definitely not. But why? Lee asked, appearing quite heartbroken. Because you're a weirdo. This sent Lee into a depressive slump for a short while and Naruto found the whole thing hilarious. Though he was wondering just what the hell Lee saw in Sakura. The short pissing contest between the Sasuke and Neji was equally funny, mostly because both of them thought they were so badass. Unknown to everyone, Sasuke was struggling with a serious case of insecurity around his towering blonde teammate and was trying to compensate by appearing as competent as possible. Naruto had shown himself to be a more powerful shinobi on just about every occasion so far, which was a direct contradiction to his previous status as a dead last. He had bought some affinity paper as soon as they got back to the village and he had been pleased to find that he had a lightning affinity along with fire. Sasuke had spent the last 2 months learning several new techniques and polishing his taijutsu in the hope that he could close the distance between himself and Naruto and reclaim his position as the stronger of the two. After all, if he couldn't even measure up to his teammate, then how was he ever going to beat Itachi? Sakura urged them to just hand in their registrations before they ran out of time. She did this mostly to prevent a fight breaking out and to get away from Lee's eyebrows. They didn't make it very far before Lee caught up to them with a challenge for Sasuke. Apparently Lee wanted to test himself against a genius, intent on proving that hard work was better than talent. There's no point in fighting him, Lee, he wouldn't be any challenge for you. Naruto told the spandex-wearing genin, leaning on the wall in a bored manner. Sasuke started grinding his teeth in anger at being dismissed so easily by his teammate. But Naruto, I wish to fight him anyway, just to see how far my hard work has brought me in comparison to a genius. Lee insisted. Enough. I'll fight this freak. Sasuke burst out angrily. Sakura looked on nervously. She had faith in Sasuke's strength, but it had been proven repeatedly that Naruto was stronger, and the blonde had said that Lee was his sparring partner. The following beatdown was highly amusing for Naruto, as Sasuke was completely unable to keep up with Lee's speed, and even more hilarious was the fact that he hadn't even taken his weights off. He was actually pretty disappointed when Guy-sensei and his summoned turtle showed up. Well, watching Sakura and Sasuke freaking out during their first exposure to the Sunset Genjutsu was pretty funny too. You guys really need to calm down, you're attracting too much attention, spoke a silver-haired genin. All three rookie teams had just gathered together at the entrance of room 301 and had been creating quite a ruckus when this silver-haired newcomer had intruded on the reunion. Who the hell are you? Came the rude question from Ino. I'm Yakushi Kabuto, and I just came to warn you that you're making targets of yourself, but I guess you can't help not knowing how things work in the Chunin exam, since you're rookies. Kabuto said good-naturedly. So this isn't your first time taking this exam? Sakura asked. No, actually this is my 7th time. Kabuto replied with some embarrassment. So does that mean that you're something of an expert on the Chunin exam? Sakura asked, hoping to get some useful information out of the silver-haired teenager. You could say that. Some expert, if he's failed 7 times. Shikamaru grumbled. Well, I haven't been completely wasting my time, since I've collected quite a lot of information on my Nin info cards. Kabuto countered. Nin info cards? What kind of information do you have? Sakura asked. All sorts of things, such as which counters are participating and how many genin they sent. Kabuto said and activated the first card in his stack to demonstrate. This year we have some pretty stiff competition. Konoha has the most teams in the exam, followed by Suna, Taki, Kusa, AIM, and finally just the one team from Oto. It's not surprising that Otogakure sent only one team since they're a new hidden village. Do you have any information on individuals? Sasuke asked, suddenly interested. Why yes, I do. If you tell me something about whoever you're interested in, then I can see if I have anything on them. Kabuto confirmed. Rock Lee of Konoha, Sabaku no Gaara of Suna, and Uzumaki Naruto of Konoha. Sasuke stated. Trying to see if this guy is gonna know anything about me that you don't know already, princess. Naruto mocked. Stop calling me princess, you. Sasuke scowled. I'll stop calling you a princess when you stop pouting like one. Naruto retorted with a grin pulling at his lips. Don't insult Sasuke-kun like that dead last. Ino yelled, making Sakura suddenly fear for her rival. You're lucky that we're in the middle of an exam, but if you call me dead last again I'm going to plant your head into a wall. Naruto coldly told the Yamanaka with his teeth bared. Ino was about to throw another insult at him, but Shikamaru quickly stopped her. The lazy Nara had seen that Naruto was being dead serious, and seeing as the older genin was not wearing anything to conceal the powerful muscle on his body, he could easily believe that he was capable of it. Alright, I've got the cards you asked for. Kabuto said, calling attention to himself again. Rock Lee graduated the year before you. His teammates are Tenten and Hyuga Neji, team leader is Maeda Guy. He has completed 45 D ranks and 23 C ranks. His performance in the academy was pretty terrible, tied for dead last actually, but he's become very capable in the past year. His skill with taijutsu is very high, but he doesn't know anything at all about ninjutsu or genjutsu. Next up, Sabaku no Gaara. Since he's not from Konoha, I don't know much about his skills, but I do know that his teammates are his older siblings Tamari and Kankuro, and their team leader is Baki. I don't know this for sure, but his team has supposedly been on a B-rank mission already, and that he has returned from every mission without so much as a scratch. Everyone was quite surprised to hear this, as genin weren't supposed to be given B-rank missions, and for a genin to never get even scratched was remarkable. Have you been trolling for trouble with Suna Sasuke? Naruto asked curiously, wondering why he'd want to know about this particular genin. We ran into him the other day and he seemed pretty strong. Sakura informed. Alright. Lastly, Uzumaki Naruto was the dead last in the academy for 4 years running, graduated the academy on his 5th try. He seemed to be a lost cause as a shinobi, but has been doing well for himself since he graduated. Not much is known about his abilities, but he presumably has high skill with taijutsu as he was seen training with Rock Lee. Teammates are Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura. Team leader is Hitaki Kakashi, the copy ninja. He has completed 30 D ranks, 4 C ranks and amazingly 1 A rank. This shocked everyone except for Team 7. How the hell did you guys get assigned an A- rank mission? Kiba asked in shock. We didn't. The client lied about the ranking. It was supposed to be AC rank. Naruto explained shortly. There have also been rumors about Uzumaki-san. Kabuto said in an embarrassed manner. Rumors? Ino asked. She always liked to hear rumors. Sakura and Sasuke suddenly looked very uncomfortable and wanted to be somewhere, anywhere else. Sasuke was already regretting asking about his blonde teammate, as he hadn't learned anything new, and now it looked like Team 7's most embarrassing secret was about to be revealed. Well, embarrassing for Sakura and Sasuke at least. Apparently, Uzumaki-san has something of a reputation for sleeping with female clients on missions. In fact, most of his D ranks seem to consist of poorly hidden excuses for female clients to sleep with him. The assembled genin had their jaws hanging in disbelief, but one look at the embraced Sasuke and Sakura confirmed it. Hinata was blushing furiously, with Ino only slightly less. What the hell, man? You mean while we've been chasing cats, painting fences and picking up garbage, Naruto has been having all over the place and getting paid for it? Kiba burst out in a fit of jealous rage. Sounds about right, Naruto said with a grin. What the hell is so special about you that so many women would want to sleep with you anyway? Kiba continued ranting, still consumed with jealousy. To name just a few things. I'm an adult, blonde, badass whose body doesn't look like a wet noodle. I don't smell like dog all the time, and my is the size of your forearm. Naruto stated in a deadpan voice, completely without shame. Hinata's brain was cooking by this point, with Ino and Sakura not far behind. Even the guys weren't able to contain their blushes at the blunt declaration. Oh yeah, I ain't buying that for a second, so don't go making declarations like that unless you're willing to whip it out and prove it. Kiba raved, trying to somehow come out on top in this discussion despite his blushing face. Wordlessly, Naruto's hands went to his pants and started taking them off, making Hinata pass out, and everyone else achieved Hinata-level blushes, heating the room up considerably. Before he could take the pants off though, Sakura got her wits together and started yelling at her blonde teammate. Damn it, Naruto, keep it in your pants. Don't you have any shame? Naruto stopped trying to remove his pants and looked thoughtful for a second. Not really, no. Quiet down, you punks, came the voice of the scar-faced man who was presumably in charge of the first phase of the exam. At this point, the team of Sound Genin realized that they had been so caught up in watching the spectacle that the Konoha rookies were putting on that they had missed their chance to take a swing at Kabuto. Our youthful students should be taking the first part of the exam by now. Guy said with enthusiasm. Huh, you say something, Guy, Kakashi responded dully. Gah, curse you and your cool, hip ways, Kakashi. At least your student Naruto is more youthful than you. The green beast said back. Asuma and Kurenai just looked at this familiar scene with amusement. The 4 Junin were lounging around, waiting for their respective genin to finish the first test. How about we make a little friendly wager? Asuma asked, interrupting Guy's ranting, making the other three Junin look at him with interest. What kind of wager? Kurenai asked curiously. A wager about which of our genin teams will do the best in the exam. Asuma explained with a grin. A most youthful idea. I wager 500 ryo on my students. Guy eagerly agreed. I'll join in on that. 500 ryo on my team, well, Naruto and Sasuke at least. Kakashi said lazily. Sakura had been improving lately, but she had been so far behind that if the other two weren't so strong, he would never have considered letting them participate in the exam. As expected from my eternal rival. I'll put 500 ryo on my team, though I think only Shikamaru is going to make it to the finals. Asuma joined in with a bet of his own. There was silence for a while before Asuma spoke up again. Aren't you going to bet on your team, Kurenai? I'd love to say that my team is going to do the best, but I can't honestly convince myself that they have any chance of beating Naruto. Kurenai said with a sigh. Wasn't he the dead last for several years now? Why wouldn't your team be able to beat him? Asuma asked skeptically. Kakashi smiled, feeling very proud of his student. Naruto is the type of guy that always has some surprises in store. Indeed, he has been a most youthful sparring partner for Lee. Guy agreed with a cheesy smile. If it was just that, I would still bet on my team, but the problem is that he beat me in a spar. Kurenai revealed with resignation. Asuma stared at her with a slack-jawed expression. How the hell did a genin, a fresh one at that, beat you? The eternal rivals also leaned in with interest. He came to me because he needed a genjutsu specialist to help him with a fuinjutsu project he has going on and asked me to teach him how to dispel genjutsu. While I was teaching him this, he somehow managed to condense his chakra to the point that he became completely immune to genjutsu. Since illusions were useless, I had to fight him with only taijutsu and ninjutsu, and he was just too strong and too fast, I couldn't keep up. The worst part is that I think he could have used fuinjutsu to end it even faster. The red-eyed Junin explained to them. Immune to genjutsu? How the hell did he manage that? Asuma asked in shock. I've discussed this with him and we've theorized that if a normal person's chakra flows like water, his is more like thick mud. When he's actively condensing it, it's more like wet concrete, meaning that it's just so dense that the chakra from the genjutsu I try to cast on him can't flow properly, making him immune. But with that kind of chakra, how can he even use ninjutsu? The chain-smoking Junin asked in wonder. He can't really, at least not regular ninjutsu. The only ninjutsu that he can use are specialized ones like shadow clones and ones that he creates himself that only someone with chakra like his can use. Kakashi explained. The way you said that just now makes me think that he might actually know some ninjutsu besides the shadow clone. Kurenai asked with narrowed eyes, wondering if the blonde had actually been holding back during their spar. Kakashi just smiled at the female Junin, but didn't answer. Well, I'll bet 500 ryo anyway. I'd feel like a terrible teacher if I didn't have any faith in my team. I'm pretty sure that at least one of them will make it to the finals at least. Naruto stared at the questions on the written test in front of him. He couldn't even begin to understand a single damn one. If I knew this was going to be a written test, I wouldn't have bothered to take off the resistance seals. After the scarred man had introduced himself as Morino Ibiki, the proctor of the first phase of the exam, he had told them the rules for this test and left them to sweat over the ridiculously hard questions. Naruto had been suspicious ever since he had heard that getting caught cheating would only cost them 2 points, and now seeing the too hard test only solidified that impression. We have to cheat. Now the problem was how exactly he could cheat. He had no bloodlines that he could use to gather information, and he didn't have any other tricks he could use either. Getting caught cheating will result in a loss of 2 points. As long as he only got caught cheating once, then it didn't matter how obvious he was, as long as he got all the answers in one try. The blonde scoped out the other genin to see who seemed to be filling out the test with the most competence. Several people appeared to have caught on already and were busily writing answers onto their tests. Who are they copying it from? Naruto condensed his chakra and suddenly several of the genin looked older. Disguised chunin, no doubt planted so that there was someone to cheat off of. Naruto smirked to himself, planted his feet on the table and decided to take a short nap. He would wait for the planted chunin to fill out the test and then make his move. He never noticed Hinata next to him looking over at him with curiosity. She would have been worried, but the big blonde looked so utterly unconcerned that she could only deduce that he had a plan. At the front of the classroom, Ibiki looked over at the blonde as well. He had no idea what Uzumaki was playing at, but he looked cooler than an iceberg, all the stress that the others were under not even touching him. At the 40-minute mark, Naruto's eyes opened and he stood up, catching the attention of everyone that saw him. Ibiki didn't say anything as the blonde began moving towards one of the planted chunin. The chunin himself hadn't seen the blonde move as Naruto had been sitting behind him. A fist thundered into the chunin without warning, knocking him out immediately. Naruto calmly took the test back to his seat, erased the name and replaced it with his own, leaving the entire room gaping at him. Not very subtle of you, Uzumaki. Ibiki commented dryly. It's a good thing that I don't need to be subtle then, as long as I only do it once. Naruto countered. True enough. Ibiki agreed. Just in case anyone has any ideas about repeating that stunt, however, the next person to try that fails the test. Why the hell does he get away with it and we can't? A genin in his late 20s burst out angrily. Because he had the stones to come up with it himself instead of just copying what someone else did. Now no more questions. Ibiki barked. Naruto went back to relaxing for the last few minutes before the time came for the final question. There's a special rule for the 10th question. Ibiki spoke ominously. Special rule? Someone asked. You must choose whether to take the question or not. What happens if we don't take it? Tamari asked. Then you and your team immediately fail the test. Ibiki answered with a smirk. What kind of stupid rule is that? Of course we're gonna take the question then. Came the grumbles from the gathered genin. The reason for the rule is, because if you get the question wrong, then you will never be allowed to participate in the chunin exam again. The scarred proctor said with finality. That's bullshit, there are people here who have taken the exam before. Kiba burst out. Well then you're just unlucky, because this time I make the rules. Ibiki said with a sinister chuckle. Now choose, those of you who don't want to take the question, raise your hands. After several tense minutes, someone broke and raised his hand, apologizing to his teammates. This started a flood of people raising their hands and giving up. Naruto kept his feet on the desk the entire time, completely unconcerned. He very much doubted that Ibiki had the authority to prevent genin from ever again participating in the chunin exam, and even if he did by some miracle have that authority, Naruto didn't care what rank he was. He had already gotten access to all the fuinjutsu knowledge that was open to the village, and the rest of the things in the chunin and junin sections of the library were more than likely of no interest to him, as he couldn't make use of most of it, due to his special situation with chakra. It would in fact possibly be in his best interest to stay a genin. That way he could keep gaining power without being bogged down by extra responsibility. Ibiki looked over at the blonde Uzumaki lounging with his feet propped on the desk with absolutely no concern. His unbreakable calm was bolstering the courage of those around him and keeping them from giving up. What about you, Uzumaki? You won't be able to punch someone to get the answer to the last question. Naruto opened his eyes and met the dark gaze of the scarred proctor. Then I'll kick someone instead. Ibiki couldn't help but chuckle at the answer. It's not gonna be that easy. Are you really going to risk staying a genin for the rest of your career as a shinobi on the off chance that you can get around the rules like that again? I really don't give a damn what rank I am, so this attempt to scare me is pretty pointless. Besides, I don't believe for a second that you have the authority to keep someone a genin forever, especially those who aren't even from Konoha. Naruto replied airily. Ibiki resisted the urge to frown. His attempt to psyche up the blonde had backfired on him. Instead of making more people quit, it seemed that the Uzumaki's calm attitude had settled the nerves of the whole room. I guess there's no use dragging it out any further then. Very well then. Everyone in this room passes the first phase of the exam. The expected pandemonium broke out, with indignant people demanding to know if the previous 9 questions were all pointless then. Everyone calmed down once they heard the explanation about how Chunin often had to make decisions without proper information and that those who didn't have the courage to even risk their rank wouldn't have the courage to risk their lives. Ibiki had just covered up his extensively scarred head and given a short lecture on the importance of information when a black blur smashed through a window. The blur turned out to be a kunoichi wrapped in a banner, which she pinned to the wall with kunai by way of introduction and posed in front of it. Proctor of the second exam, the Y in single Mitarashi Anko, was written boldly on the banner, with the woman in question standing in front of it. Anko certainly had an interesting fashion sense, dressed as she was in a tan overcoat that barely concealed her mesh armor-covered S. The mesh extended to just above her knees. Her light purple hair was styled into a spiky ponytail and an orange mini skirt sat on her hips. Her feet were covered by black shinobi sandals and light gray shin guards. All in all, she was a very interesting woman to be sure. Most of the genin were gawking at her stupidly, still stunned by the spectacular entrance, and several were staring due to her barely covered assets. Naruto gave her a wolf whistle, making her look at him. A groan was heard from Sakura, but it was ignored. I give you a 9 out of 10 for the entrance. You get extra points for crashing through the window, but your timing was off and your pose could use work. The blonde commented with the air of a judge at a formal competition. Anko had been intending to make a quick head count and then get on Ibiki's case about being too soft, even if there had only been a few genin left, but the muscly blonde had quite successfully diverted attention to himself. And who exactly are you, brat? Anko asked with an infuriating smirk. Naruto vanished from his seat and appeared in front of the newly arrived proctor in a burst of speed. Who are you calling a brat, shorty? The blonde said as he towered over the considerably smaller special Junin. And the name is Uzumaki Naruto. Anko glared upwards at the taller shinobi. She hated being called short. She recognized the name though. This was the guy that Kurenai had been telling her about. Anko had been pretty surprised to hear that Kurenai had developed a romantic interest in anyone, let alone a genin, but the red-eyed Junin had warned her not to take this one lightly, and the speed with which he'd moved certainly gave credence to that. The two of them continued glaring at each other for a tense few seconds until Naruto suddenly grinned his usually sharp-toothed grin. I like your style, Anko. The blonde said, deliberately using a familiar form of address that most would consider incredibly rude to use with someone that they'd just met. Your style isn't so bad either, Naruto. She replied with a grin of her own, irritation transformed into enjoyment. She never liked it when people were being overly polite when they talked to each other, and it was refreshing to encounter someone who felt the same. The fact that they liked each other's style may have something to do with the fact that it was the same style. They both wore open coats that left their chests bare. Granted, Anko wore a mesh shirt underneath, but it was just at the edge of indecent and Naruto was a man, so he could pull off the shirtless look somewhat easier. A thought suddenly went through Anko's head. What if Kurenai has the hots for me and transferred it to this guy because she's in denial about being a lesbian? He's like a male version of me. Kami, damn it, Naruto, we're in the middle of an exam. Don't you think this is a bad time to be trying to get into another woman's panties? Came Sakura's desperate wail. Both Naruto and Anko became aware of the fact that they had been utterly ignoring the rest of the room, most of which were gaping at them. The rookies from Konoha who hadn't had much exposure to Naruto since graduating from the academy were gaping at how brazen the blonde was and suddenly felt a wave of pity for Sakura and Sasuke who had to deal with him all the time. Ibiki was also looking rather annoyed at the two of them, but neither of them really cared. Anko frequently made certain to annoy Ibiki and Naruto wasn't the type to give a damn who he annoyed. Naruto turned towards his pink-haired teammate and looked at her with the air of someone who was about to reveal a great secret of existence. It's always a good time to get into a hot woman's panties. He finished with a serene smile, sunlight pinging off his teeth in a manner eerily reminiscent of Maida Guy. Rock Lee was reminded powerfully of his sensei and instinctively began to write down this pearl of wisdom in his ever-present notebook, much to the horror of his teammates. Several other people in the room were looking at the blonde with tears streaming from their eyes and barely restraining sobs, looking as if they had just heard the voice of the prophet. But what if I'm not wearing any panties? Anko asked with a wide grin, causing mass nosebleeds. Then I think that you just might be my third or fourth favorite woman in the world. Naruto answered with a similarly wide grin. He couldn't believe that he'd just found someone who was just as shameless as him. Third or fourth? You must know some interesting women, Blondie. The snake user commented, not at all offended at being third or fourth. Considering that they had met all of 5 minutes ago, that was pretty damn high on the list. Oh, they're definitely interesting, all right. The blonde said, thinking mostly of Xana. Ayame was firmly in the number 2 position and Tsunami was still special to him, even though he vaguely hoped he never saw her again, for the sake of simplicity. A loud and highly irritated throat-clearing noise precluded any more banter. Weren't you going to tell them about the second part of the exam, Anko? Ibiki ground out through clenched teeth. It was just his luck that Anko had discovered a kindred spirit and he had to be there to see it. Oh right, meet me at Training Ground 44 tomorrow, ask your sensei for directions if you don't know where it is. The perplet said and jumped out the broken window. The gathered genin were looking at the freakishly large forest that was marked as the 44th Training Ground with trepidation. Welcome to Training Ground 44, also called the Forest of Death. Anko said with relish, enjoying the scared looks that some of the genin were sporting. This sure is a creepy place. Sakura said nervously. You will be able to experience why this place is called the Forest of Death. Anko continued with a smile. Naruto scoffed at her, knowing that she was going to be annoyed by it and therefore provoked. He was right, of course, as a kunai whizzed at him. If left alone it would have cut his cheek open, but it was instead caught in his hand. Anko suddenly appeared behind him with another kunai in her hand drifting towards his cheek. Tough guys like you tend to spill the most blood in there. She whispered hotly in his ear, cutting into his cheek with the kunai. Only to be shocked when Naruto burst into smoke, revealing that it had been a shadow clone. The snake mistress suddenly found large hands grabbing her waist and a man's crotch grinding against her rear. Proctor-san, I have a medical condition that I need to tell you about. Naruto whispered in her ear, just as hotly as she had done mere seconds earlier. What is this medical condition of yours, genin? Anko asked, playing along. Whenever a beautiful and bold woman throws deadly weapons at my head, I become incredibly aroused. Naruto explained his problem. Well, that's some terrible luck you have, Genin, because the second part of the exam will have many people throwing deadly weapons at your head and some of them are going to be women. Anko countered without sympathy. I'm not afraid of that, since most of the females in that forest are going to be too young for my taste, but there is this incredibly white proctor who's got my blood boiling and I'm having trouble restraining myself. Naruto growled suggestively, his hands wandering upwards. Anko twisted out of his hold and slashed a thin line diagonally across his chest with the kunai she still had in her hand, from his abs up to his pectorals. The wound was long, but not very deep and didn't bleed much. Certainly not in any way debilitating, aside from a slight sting. We'll see about that if you do well in the exam, Genin. She was never going to tell anyone, but she had started feeling embarrassed. Because she could feel his erection growing against her rear and because of the suggestive tone in his words. The way that he'd been rubbing against her left no doubt as to what he'd have liked to do to her. All the other genin present had been observing this with blushes burning on their faces. The Konoha rookies in particular were the worst off as they had actually sort of known Naruto, and seeing the resigned irritation on the faces of Sakura and Sasuke couldn't help but feel another wave of pity for them. Clearly things like this weren't anything out of the ordinary and they couldn't imagine having to deal with someone like him all the time. Other than their joint pity for Sakura and Sasuke, there were several varying reactions among the rookies. Kiba was jealous of Naruto's easy way with the ladies. Shikamaru thought the whole thing was troublesome and it reaffirmed his opinion that blondes were the most troublesome. Ino was soaking the whole thing up as if it was a soap opera. Sakura and Sasuke were annoyed, irritated and resigned. Choji was eating his chips faster than normal in an effort to cope with his embarrassment. Shino was uncharacteristically embarrassed and trying to understand the logic of it. Hinata took the lion's share of the embarrassment, but she was also envious of both Anko and Naruto and of how confident they were. As Anko explained that they needed to sign consent forms because people would be dying inside the forest, Hinata decided that she would try overcome her shyness and embarrassment and try to do something. It was for this reason that she approached the big blonde holding a small jar of her homemade healing cream. She was relieved that he was standing alone under a tree, as she didn't think she'd be able to do this if there were other people around. Naruto-san, I have some C crossing cream that can help W with your WO wound. She managed to stutter out. Naruto looked at the shy Hyuga in front of him. She was all but trembling from the effort it had taken her to approach and make the offer, and she looked for all the world like an adorable little girl with that blush on her face. If it had been Ino or Sakura he would have brushed them off, but he'd feel like he kicked a puppy if he did that to Hinata. Besides, out of all the girls in the academy, she was the only one who hadn't been trying to get the attention of one boy or another, which was more than could be said for all the others. The wound would close by itself within the next 3 or 4 minutes even without treatment, but he decided to humor the pale-eyed girl, as it had clearly taken her a lot of guts to do this. Alright, but you've got to call me Ni-san from now on. Of course, he was still Naruto, so he couldn't just accept something and leave it at that. Hinata flushed with embarrassment again, but she actually liked that idea, so this was all a plus for her. She nodded her head and held out the cream to him. Oh no, you're the medic here, so go ahead and apply the cream to the wound. The blonde said, holding his coat open for her and sticking his chest out. Hinata once again developed radioactive levels of embarrassment, but did her best to power through it. Scooping up a generous dollop of the cream, she brought it to his chest and started rubbing it across the wound, face flaming the entire time. There why you go, Ni-san. The Hyuga girl managed to stutter out, but she was in truth happy about the way things had gone. She had managed to get through the whole embarrassing ordeal without passing out, and Naruto had told her to call him Ni-san. She had grown to admire the blonde for his boldness ever since that day when he had come to ask Kurenai-sensei to help him with genjutsu, and this sense of closeness to him was comforting. He was the only older male figure in her life at the moment that didn't treat her as if she was a worthless irritation, so the fact that he had demanded to be called Big Brother, whatever his reason for it, was actually the best possible outcome as far as she was concerned. Some distance away, Anko had nearly choked on her spit when she had heard the blonde demand to be called Big Brother. She could already imagine that stuck-up prick Hiyashi having an aneurysm when he caught wind of this. Oh, it was going to be fun telling Kurenai about this little development.